And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network. We're going to take you now to Thousand Oaks, California, at the scene of a deadly shooting, another deadly shooting. It seems like we're just reporting these every week, unfortunately. This left 12 people dead, and the man who is suspected of doing this, Ian D. Long, 28 years old, he turned the gun on himself. I want to bring in my panel now of experts. Andrew Bringuel, he's an FBI profiler. He's been a guest with us here before, has a lot of experience in analyzing these sorts of situations, as well as Ron Lowy, a criminal defense attorney. Also, he used to represent Cesar Sayoc, who is the pipe bomb suspect involved in another incident that happened earlier this month involving those packages that were sent to anti-Trump Democrats across the country. Guys, what do you make of the latest happening in California here? Andrew?
Well, Rachel, I think you mentioned you're reporting this every week. It's in fact more frequent than that. According to the open source information, there's been 307 mass shootings, that's victims of 4 or more, in the last 311 days. And we see this, all too frequently because of a number of reasons. And typically when we're looking at these type of perpetrators or subjects, we're looking at, in very simple terms, people who are bad, just bad people, like Omar Mateen, who went into a nightclub and shot people up because he was following ISIS. People who are mad, people who are mentally ill. And this may be the case in this particular shooting. It certainly was with Esteban Santiago in Fort Lauderdale. And then other people who are simply sad. They're desperate and they want to kill themselves. And again, this could be the case in the Ventura shooting as well. We'll find that out as they go through the evidence.
And Ron, what do you make of all of this?
Well, when you look at the various subjects, these individuals who are arrested for these crimes, they seem to have certain characteristics that are consistent. They're almost always loners. They are usually unmarried or estranged from their family. They're individuals, as Andrew said, that are angry. But if we look historically, they almost always show some history of mental illness. And Mr. Long, for example, in Thousand Oaks last year, the police interacted with him, but they could not do anything based on the laws in California. In Florida, my former client, Mr. Sayoc, when I represented him, he threatened to blow up FP&L back in 2002. No mental health counseling was offered by the criminal courts. None was required by the Florida laws. We need to make changes to these laws. When we see the signs, when individuals are showing indications of mental illness, we have a responsibility as a society, 1, to prevent future harm, and 2, to help those that are sick, that their families want to help, by creating a process where families can compel medical treatment. Currently, there is no method to force someone to get counseling, outpatient, inpatient, until they show that they're a danger to themselves or others, and by then it's usually too late.
So, Andrew, let's talk a little bit about this man, Ian Long. From what we understand, he was a Marine who had served in Afghanistan. He had purchased that gun that was used in the shooting legally. And there was an incident, as was mentioned before, where police responded to his home in April. I believe it was some kind of domestic situation, and it's believed he might have suffered from PTSD. When you're looking at the mind of someone that would do it, does this guy Long fit into that profile?
Well, Rachel, that's an excellent question, and one where we need to be careful when we use the term profile. And we really don't have a profile of a mass shooter. As I mentioned, there's 3 categories: bad, mad, and sad, different characteristics. But you have people like Robert Bowers, who is a white supremacist, who goes into a synagogue and shoots a bunch of Jewish parishioners. We have people that do it for a lot of different reasons. And if you want to break it down into a motive taxonomy, basically they follow one of 4 paths: personal motives, economic motives, social motives, or political motives. And the last 2, social and political, we define them as terrorists. And the other 2 could be anything from a guy going into a bank and shooting a bunch of people to someone who in this particular case might be suffering from PTSD. He's also going through a divorce. So there's some indicators, and if we go back to April, it points to the difficulty in trying to stop these types of shootings. Mental health professionals, according to the Ventura Sheriff's Department, looked at this subject. They assessed him, but the critical element where they have to determine whether there's a commitment order or not is expressed credible threat. And so they asked 3 basic questions. And that's really what we get away from profiling. We look at behavioral assessment. We can ask these questions, and these are the 3. Mental state. What is his mental state at the time? Is he mentally ill or exhibiting evidence of mental illness? Thoughts of hurting himself or others. And so that has to be demonstrated generally by past behavior. And there's a difficulty there because we're asking for a sort of a minority report, futuristic kind of estimation of his behavior, and they typically look at it forensically in terms of past behavior. The 3rd question is access to weapons. And of course, in this particular case, he bought a weapon. But in the Esteban case, Esteban Santiago, he was also committed, and his weapon in 2012 was taken away from him. But then it was given back to him in 2014. And after he was hearing voices, also a veteran, by the way, who was affected by his service in Iraq. And then he boards an airplane, goes to Fort Lauderdale, checks his weapon out, which he legally had checked in at baggage, takes the weapon out and shoots 5 people in the airport in Fort Lauderdale. So it's a question. Yes, I'm sorry.
Andrew, let me ask you specifically, and I don't want to get too weedy into the, laws in California if you're not familiar. But is it possible, so you talk about the 3 checks, and this is Ian Long right here, a picture of him, the gunman in the California shooting. You talk about the 3 kind of factors that mental health professionals use to determine whether someone could be a risk. Is there anything that mental health professionals can do legally to basically commit someone in the state of California? I know different states have different laws regarding this.
Yes, every state has a law, and they do vary by state. But in the state of California, mental health professionals with the police can commit an individual involuntarily to assess their threat at a given time. But I think it's deeper than that, Rachel, and there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way we approach these types of issues. Typically, a mental health professional is interested in care of the patient and to get their mental state back on a level and balanced plane, whereas police are charged with security. And so I think that there has to be better coordination and communication between the mental health professionals and the police. And I know police say at times that they're not mental health professionals, they're not sociologists or psychologists, but that doesn't mean they couldn't have that function. In these particular cases, and now police departments in some cases are now moving towards crisis mitigation teams with officers who have the specialized training to look at threat, not just care issues, but what's the risk, what's the threat variables, and what are the consequences if we don't move and secure this individual and assess his long-term behavior.
Ron, maybe you can answer this. Aren't there a lot of laws, though, that are prohibiting mental health professionals sharing data and information that they have collected with the police?
Yes, there are. There are restrictions under HIPAA and other state laws that prevent the sharing of the medical information. But there's a tremendous amount of social information that's acquired through schools, through police entities, that can be utilized in order to treat people before they get too late. For instance, in Dade County today, if Mr. Sack had been arrested for the 2002 threat now, Dade County has a mental health court. He would likely have been diverted to that mental health court and gotten required counseling and medical treatment in order to resolve his case. However, Dade County's program is an experiment. Most do not have such a program. Most counties don't offer that. We need to begin to change our laws across the country. We need to be able to assess people before they enter the criminal justice system. For instance, Mr. Cruz, in his school setting, he should have been tagged, not in an inappropriate way to harm him in the future, but in a way to get him socialized, counseling, the assistance he needed. And as an adult or a young adult, once you interact with the criminal justice system, if you're showing signs, treatment needs to be mandatory. Right now, most of criminal justice is punishment. There's
no treatment. Yeah, and you know what's quite unfortunate? We have to wrap up this segment in just a second here, but you know, it's been reported that this bar where this shooting in California happened, Borderline is the name of the bar, was actually a spot where some of the survivors of the Las Vegas mass shooting would gather. And from information from various reports, including the New York Times, there were, I think, 2 survivors of the Las Vegas shooting as well that were at this bar. Listen, I don't know, perhaps this guy, Ian, he knew that, and that's why he targeted this bar. But it just makes you angry, Andrew, that we can't do anything to stop it. And, you know, the anti-gun folks will say, well, we need stricter gun laws. But in this particular case, that wouldn't have stopped anything. This guy legally had a weapon.
Yeah, I think the key here is to improve our education of these types of issues, not just for police or mental health, but the general public. This gentleman, according to relatives who are close to this person, said that he was isolated. His mother feared that he might do something like this. So reporting it to the professionals who can do an assessment. The next piece has been mentioned is legislation, which needs to be strengthened in terms of the cooperation and the work done between police and mental health professionals. And then preparedness, we need to do a better job of performing in terms of our assessments, like the Cruz case, where he was looked at and some follow-up welfare checks should have occurred. And then the last is response. And unfortunately, we're seeing too many of those cases where we've had to respond and pick up the pieces after these broken people do violent damage to our society.
Well, Andrew and Ron, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this very, very important and tragic story. We're going to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Stay with us.